I'm Linda Weston, 69 years old, and 6 days after laying my husband to rest, my only son pulled the car over on a foggy back road in Oregon and told me this was where I got out. He didn't raise his voice or look at me, just stared straight ahead, one hand tapping the steering wheel like we were waiting at a red light. I thought it was a bad joke, even gave a soft laugh until he handed me my purse. No suitcase, no phone. Just the slippers I'd been wearing since the funeral. "You'll figure something out," he said, like I was some stranger, not the woman who'd raised him, and then he drove off. The taillights, swallowed up by the mist like a door closing on 40 years of my life. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt invisible to the people you gave everything to. I didn't cry. I stood there on the side of that road in Henry's slippers, and a coat too light for April. The fog hung low, thick enough to muffle sound, and I could hear my own breath louder than anything else. 8 miles from town, maybe more. We'd just buried Henry on a Tuesday. Hospice came fast in the end. He didn't want a long goodbye, just dignity. I'd honored that. I held his hand through it. I never thought I'd walk out of that house without him, but I sure never imagined I'd be shoved out like garbage. Eric had been a quiet boy growing up. Smart, thoughtful when he wanted to be. He used to run into my arms after school, muddy shoes and all clutching little drawings he'd made just for me. I still have a box of them in the back of my closet, turkey hands, dinosaurs with lopsided teeth, blue whales that looked like clouds. We built the Jensen House B&B from nothing. Just Henry, me, and 2 spare rooms over our old garage. We laid the tile by hand, painted every inch of trim, cooked breakfast for guests ourselves before Eric was even tall enough to reach the stove. That house was more than walls. It was our life. Henry used to say first impressions mattered, so we planted rose bushes by the front walk, 2 red, 2 peach, 2 yellow, and every guest who stepped out of their car smelled something sweet before they ever rang the bell. That was his idea of hospitality. Mine was warm biscuits at check-in and handwritten notes tucked under pillows. It was never fancy, but it was honest. Eric changed somewhere along the way. He got older, married. Susan started using words like branding and streamline, said the house needed upgrades, said the inn needed a new name. I didn't argue. Not then. I thought letting go a little was the kind of generosity a mother gives to a grown child. But as I walked through that mist, my feet aching and my hands clenched deep in my coat, I realized something else. It wasn't generosity. I'd been erased. By the time I reached the old general store on Main Street, my knees were shaking. Grace took one look at me and wrapped me in a blanket before I could protest. Sat me down. Made me coffee. Let me say he left me without asking who or why. Sometimes kindness is quiet like that. I spent that first night in a trucker motel off the highway. Paid cash, no ID, just enough to feel safe. That was Henry's rule. Always keep a little tucked in the lining of your purse. A woman should never be without a backup, he'd said. The next morning, I sat on the edge of the bed, holding a photo in my hands, me, Henry, and a 7-year-old Eric standing in front of our first sign. Welcome to Jensen House. We were beaming. I looked at that little boy and asked myself something I never thought I would. When did he stop seeing me as his mother? And more quietly, when did I stop seeing this coming? The motel room was quiet enough to hear the hum of the fridge and the soft rattle of the heater when it kicked on. I hadn't touched the television. I sat in the chair by the window with a blanket pulled tight around my shoulders, watching the headlights pass out on the highway and wondering how something that was mine, our house, our business, my life could vanish so quickly. The fog had started to lift that morning, but the air still held that coastal chill that settles deep in your joints if you let it. I wrapped my fingers around the edges of a little spiral notebook I'd found in my purse. Old grocery lists, linen inventory, staffing hours, all handwritten. Inside the cover in Henry's blocky handwriting were 6 words no one knows the weight she carries. I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing Eric's voice as he pulled away, so calm, like he was just dropping me off at the market. "You'll figure something out," he'd said, like I hadn't figured everything out for him since the day he was born. I sat there tracing those words in the notebook until the ink began to smudge, and it occurred to me this wasn't confusion. This was clarity. They thought I'd sit quietly in the dark, but I still had the ledger. I still had Henry's documents. And I still had the deed, the one Eric had never taken my name off. The next afternoon, I called a cab and asked the driver to take me back to the house. I said I needed to pick up a winter coat. He didn't ask questions. I knew Eric and Susan were out of town for some kind of conference. I hadn't planned anything beyond grabbing my sewing kit and maybe a photo album. But when I stepped into the entryway, I didn't smell lemon oil or wood smoke. The air was flat, stale, like something had stopped breathing. The key bowl was gone, replaced with a glass dish holding a fake orchid and nothing else. I walked down the hall, slow, steady, until I reached the hallway closet. That filing cabinet had been there since Henry built it into the wall himself. Beige dented in one corner. I opened the top drawer. There it was, a manila folder labeled Ownership Transfer, Jensen House. The date on the label stopped me 5 days before Henry died. I opened it and stared at the paper inside. My name, Eric's name, a scanned signature that looked enough like mine to fool someone in a hurry, but not me. My hands had been too full with broth and medication to sign anything during those last days. I hadn't left Henry's side. I hadn't picked up a pen. And even if I had, I never used the month first format. That was Eric. He always wrote dates that way, even on Christmas cards. My stomach turned. There were blank witness lines. No notary, just names, a stamp, and a signature that wasn't mine. I sat down right there on the tile floor with that folder open across my lap. For a long time, I didn't move. When I finally did, I didn't take the file. I took photos front and back, every page, every detail. I checked the timestamp. I put everything back exactly the way I found it. Then I stood, brushed off my coat, and walked out the door. I didn't look back. I headed to a little cafe near Grace's store, ordered a cup of tea I didn't even want, found a corner booth, sat there, and stared at my phone, zooming in on the pictures, rereading every word. The truth of it didn't feel sharp. It felt steady, cold. Eric had taken advantage of his dying father's trust and his mother's grief. And Susan, she was never far behind. That night, I didn't go back to the motel. I paid cash for a room at a different roadside inn under the name Anna Lee. Henry would have liked that he always said I should keep a name in my back pocket just in case. I laid the pictures out on the bed. Then I opened my notebook and wrote a new heading, Legal Leverage. It wasn't rage I felt. It was something quieter, heavier, like a rock I'd been carrying without knowing it had a name. I didn't hear from Eric. No texts, no calls. Are you okay, Mom?" Just silence. By morning, I'd made a decision. I pulled out the original deed, still folded in the lining of my overnight bag, dated 1982. Henry and Linda Weston, co-owners of Jensen House B&B. No mention of Eric. No signature from Henry on any transfer. Which meant what Eric filed couldn't override the original contract. Not without both our real signatures. That afternoon, I walked to the library and used one of the public computers. Searched Oregon property law. Found what I needed. printed a few pages, and sat in the warmth of the reading room, highlighting key phrases: fraud, invalid, transfer, elder abuse. I tucked everything into a manila folder and walked back out into the wind. I didn't shake. I didn't rush. I called Rachel that night. We hadn't spoken in over a year, not because anything happened, just time. "Linda," she said, voice exactly the same as I remembered. Well, it's about time. I told her everything: the motel, the forgery, the house. She didn't ask why I hadn't called sooner. She just said, "I've got a cabin near the lake. Come stay. Quiet. Clean. Nobody needs to know you're here." I hesitated. "Don't argue," she said. "You sound like someone who forgot she still matters." That hit something in me I didn't even know was bruised. The next morning, I left the key on the dresser and took a bus north. The driver didn't ask where I was headed. I watched the pine trees blur past the window and didn't look back once. Rachel's cabin sat near the edge of a still lake, the kind of quiet that settles into your bones. She'd left a note and a stocked fridge. Rest the note said, "Let the moss grow back." I sat on the porch, wrapped in an old wool blanket, watching the sun pull itself across the water, and realized I hadn't felt safe in a long time. Safe enough to ask the next question. Not, "Why did they do this to me?" but "What can I do now that they have?" The days at Rachel's cabin passed quietly. Morning light drifted through the curtains, soft and pale, and the lake outside stayed still as glass most of the time. I got into a rhythm: wake up, make tea, sit on the porch with the blanket Henry and I bought in Colorado one fall, the one with the red stripes. I didn't rush to figure things out. I didn't reach for answers. I just sat, and for the first time in a long while, I listened to the quiet. The quiet, it turns out, has a way of bringing up things you thought you'd put away. I started remembering moments I hadn't meant to forget, small ones, like how Susan used to call me Mom before Henry got sick, and then slowly stopped. At first, it became Linda in public, then just her in conversations I overheard. I remembered how during our last Thanksgiving together, I pulled out the wedding china ivory with the gold rim, and she smiled without warmth and said, "Maybe next year we use paper. Less fuss for you." And I'd laughed then as if it had been a joke. It wasn't. I wrote down everything I could remember in the same leather journal Henry had given me 2 Christmases ago. The pages still smelled like cedar. I made a list of every small shift, every conversation where I'd been talked around or ignored, every time I let something slide for the sake of peace. And the more I wrote, the clearer it became. It wasn't just one moment. It had been years in the making. I skipped meals without meaning to. Some days I'd forget what time it was until the light started to turn blue. My appetite was the first to go. Then, sleep. I started waking up with my heart pounding chest tight, as if I'd heard a noise in a dream I couldn't shake. The bed was warm, the room was safe, but my mind kept going. I couldn't stop thinking about how easily they had done it. The paperwork, the silence, the lies. On the 4th morning, I tried to carry a gallon jug of water from the well house to the porch. Just 50 yards or so. I'd done harder things without blinking. But halfway there, my legs buckled. The jug slipped from my arms and rolled off into the brush. I sat down in the gravel. My breath came shallow. My hands shook. I couldn't stand back up right away, so I sat there, knees drawn up, coat bunched around me, and waited. That evening, I didn't light the fire in the stove. I just curled up on the couch and stared into the shadows. The ache in my chest was dull by then, but the weight was heavier than ever. I whispered to the dark, "What did I do wrong?" I didn't say it with anger, just a question, quiet and tired. And after a long while, another thought came in behind it. Maybe I hadn't done anything wrong. Maybe I was just no longer useful to them. And once that happened, they let go without looking back. Rachel came back the next morning. She walked through the door with a grocery bag tucked under one arm and her scarf still wrapped around her neck. She took one look at me, curled up on that porch rocker, and didn't say a word. Just came over, pressed her hand gently to my forehead, and nodded like she already knew. "You look like someone who's been carrying everyone else's weight for too long," she said. She didn't ask what happened, didn't offer advice. She just made soup. We ate it together in silence, sitting across from each other at the little pine wood table. She pushed a basket of crackers toward me. I took one. It was the first solid food I'd had in almost 2 days. And I realized something as I sat there sipping broth from a chipped bowl. This was the first thing anyone had given me in weeks, without asking for something in return. That night, I pulled Henry's old journal from the bottom of my bag. Not the business ledger. The one he'd kept in the last few years, notes about the in-guest preferences, little thoughts scrawled in the margins. I hadn't touched it since he passed. On the inside cover, he'd written, "If she ever needs to know, tell her she still owns half." The ink was faded, but his handwriting was unmistakable. It felt like a light turning on in a dark hallway. The next morning, I got dressed and walked into town for the first time since arriving at the lake. I didn't have a plan, just a need to move. The air was crisp, and the gravel crunched under my shoes. I kept my coat buttoned all the way up. When I reached the little hardware store on Main, I almost turned around. But just as I stepped back, someone coming out of the shop called my name. Linda Weston. I turned and nearly didn't recognize her. She had a bag of gardening soil under one arm, her silver hair pulled tight in a bun. But her voice was the same, warm and bright like a front porch light. It was Karen, a neighbor from years ago. We'd once organized a town bake sale together when Eric was still in Cub Scouts. "Well, I'll be," she said, laughing and setting her bag down on the sidewalk. "You look like a woman who's seen some things." We both laughed sharp at first, then soft, the kind of laugh that feels like it's coming from somewhere deeper than your belly. We sat in a corner booth at the cafe down the street. 2 lattes between us, 1 cinnamon scone cut in half. I didn't tell the story in any particular order. Just let the pieces fall out as they came. The papers, the motel, the signature, the morning on the gravel path. Karen listened without interrupting. She didn't ask why I didn't stop it sooner. She didn't ask what I had done to deserve it. When I finished, she said quietly, "You didn't raise him to do that. He chose it. But you're choosing something else now. That matters." Back at the cabin, Rachel told me I could stay in her guest room in town if I wanted. She said people weren't meant to go through things like this alone. Rebuilding's not a one-woman job, she said. It's not a cleanup. It's surgery. That night, I packed up my few things. The wool blanket, Henry's journal, my purse, my papers. Rachel helped me load them into her truck. We didn't talk much on the way back. Just listened to the hum of the tires. The guest room had a floral quilt and a lamp shaped like a duck. I pulled the blanket tight around my shoulders and sat down on the edge of the bed. I didn't feel strong. I didn't feel finished. But for the first time, I didn't feel like a ghost. Rachel's guest room was quiet and warm, with a quilted bedspread in soft blues and a small ceramic lamp that gave off just enough light to see by. The house smelled like lemon polish and something slow-cooked. I hadn't realized how much noise I'd been carrying until it stopped. That first night, I didn't unpack. I just sat on the edge of the bed and ran my thumb along the seam of Henry's journal, the one he'd kept in the drawer beside the guest check-in desk. The spine was still stiff. I opened it halfway and found a page dated from the year before. Guest notes preferences, a scribbled reminder to replace a porch light bulb. Then in the margin, his handwriting again. If she ever needs to tell her she still owns half. I sat with that sentence a long time, not just reading it, feeling it, the quiet way he'd always made sure I had a foothold, even when I didn't realize I needed one. The night passed slow, but I slept all the way through without waking once. The next morning, Rachel made lemon chicken, and we ate it in our pajamas while a cooking show played in the background. She didn't bring up anything from the past few days, just handed me a coffee mug and asked how I liked my eggs. And after breakfast, I pulled out a dusty leather folder I'd brought from the inn. It had been tucked in the back of the storage cabinet behind years of invoices and handwritten menus. I hadn't looked at it in over a decade. Inside was the original partnership agreement for the Jensen house, signed, notarized, clear. Co-ownership split evenly between Henry and me. Valid unless formally amended with consent from both. I ran my finger under the wording like I needed to feel the weight of it. The papers Eric had filed, the ones with my signature, they didn't have any legal standing without that consent. And Henry hadn't signed a thing. The following day, I took a bus into Astoria. The county office was a squat brick building with beige walls and the smell of old carpet. A woman at the front desk handed me a clipboard, asked for a fee, and pointed me toward a narrow window where public records were kept. I requested the current title for the Jensen house property. $10, and a few minutes later, I had it in my hand. Eric Jensen, sole proprietor. My name wasn't there. No notary stamp, no witness initials, just one signature, clean and bold, not mine. I stood there staring at it until my shoulders went still. I wasn't angry, I was sure. I folded the copy into my coat pocket and crossed the street to a law office I'd passed 100 times before. The sign read, Hartwell and Price, Elder Law Estates Property Disputes. Inside it was quiet and warm. There was a bowl of hard candy on the receptionist's desk and soft music playing somewhere in the back. I said I needed a consultation. She asked if it was for me or for someone else. I told her it was for a friend. She smiled gently. That kind of friend. Yes, I said, that kind. The lawyer's name was Nora Price. She looked to be in her 30s, maybe younger. Dark blazer, no-nonsense shoes, kind eyes. She introduced herself and offered me water. I said no thank you, and she motioned to the chair across from her desk. I pulled the folder from my purse and placed it in front of her. She flipped through the pages without rushing. I could see her brow furrow slightly as she reached the forged transfer. This isn't your signature, she said. No, I replied. No notary, no witnesses, no. She set the folder down, folded her hands, and said, This is elder financial abuse and fraud. I sat back in my chair. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone else to say it out loud. She looked at me carefully like she was making sure I understood. We can file a motion to freeze the title, contest the transfer, possibly pursue damages if that's something you want. You still have standing. The original deed and the absence of legal authorization give us a strong case. I asked her quietly, Do people like me win? She didn't answer right away. Just gave me a small, measured smile. Not if I have anything to say about it. We don't lose cases we prepare properly. I handed her a check from the private account Henry and I opened after Eric's restaurant failed. A backup fund, just in case. Henry had given me the checkbook the year after we sold my mother's ring to cover his medical expenses. I remembered his words, quiet but firm. Keep this. One day, we might need to be nimble. That night, Rachel poured 2 glasses of red wine. We sat on the back deck, under a sky full of stars, each holding a stemless glass that caught the moonlight just enough to look elegant. I told her everything. She lifted her glass and said, "To nimbleness." We clinked. Then we laughed. The kind of laugh that lets a little air back into the lungs. Over the next week, I started writing again. Not for memory, not for closure, but for documentation. I wrote down every conversation I could recall about the business when Susan changed the passwords to the booking system when my name vanished from the website. I called the housekeeper Maria. She met me at a diner and whispered nervously that Susan had asked her to throw away mail addressed to me the week after the funeral. Bank notices, insurance papers. I called the repairman who fixed the boiler, the bakery that delivered our scones, the linen service that dropped off towels every Monday. They all remembered me. One of them said, "I thought you were the one running things." I nodded. I was. Rachel drove me to the courthouse in Tillamook, where I filed a sworn affidavit. The woman behind the counter stamped it, looked up over her glasses, and said, "Good luck, honey." "Thank you," I said, "but I've got receipts." Back at the house, I flipped through Henry's old Rolodex. It smelled like thyme. I found the name of the notary we always used, Penelope Briggs. Retired now, still in Lincoln City. I called and asked when the last time she visited the Jensen house had been. 2018, she said. Something about a zoning issue. I haven't been out there since. I thanked her and hung up. She hadn't notarized anything, which meant no one had. That evening, Nora called with a steadiness in her voice I hadn't heard before. "He's in trouble," she said. "We've got everything we need. We'll start with a motion to freeze the title and serve notice. From there, you can decide how far you want to take it." I didn't say anything right away. I just looked out the kitchen window at the porch swing Rachel had dusted off that morning. The light was dimming. The air had that early spring scent, earthy and cold. Finally, I said, "Go ahead." Rachel poured tea that night instead of wine, set the pot on the table and said, "You know what's coming next, don't you?" I nodded. "They're going to come running." She sipped slow and calm. "Let them." Nora sent the letter on a Thursday morning, certified mail track delivery, the kind that looks ordinary from the outside, thin, cream-colored, nothing special, but inside it carried a different kind of weight. A formal notice of intent to contest ownership request for audit and statement of suspected fraud. It was clear, precise, and thorough. I didn't have to write a word of it. I just signed my name at the bottom. We figured Eric would receive it by Saturday. That gave me 3 quiet days to brace myself. I stayed close to Rachel's house, took long walks through her neighborhood where the houses had porches and wind chimes and garden flags that said things like, "Welcome Spring." She'd planted tulips along her front path, and each day they opened a little wider. At night, we sat with tea instead of wine. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't pace either. I waited. The first message came Saturday afternoon. Susan's voice shaking Linda. "Please, can we talk? Eric's upset." We didn't mean for it to get this far. We were just trying to keep things simple after Henry passed. You weren't in a good place to make decisions. I didn't finish the message. Just saved it, labeled it evidence, and forwarded it to Nora. 30 minutes later, a text from Eric. "Mom, I got the letter. Can we please talk?" Then, "This is a misunderstanding. I'll fix it. I just need some time." Then finally, "Please, don't do this. I'm your son." Rachel read them over my shoulder. She didn't say anything, just reached for the kettle and poured hot water over a fresh tea bag. On Tuesday, a man in a navy jacket walked up Rachel's driveway with a clipboard in hand. I watched from the kitchen window as he approached the porch. He asked for Eric Jensen. Rachel told him he didn't live there. The man nodded then handed over a folded copy of the formal complaint. I didn't go to the door. I didn't need to. The next morning, Susan showed up. She pulled up in a dark SUV, the same one I'd helped them buy 2 years ago, when they said the old car wasn't safe for the kids. Her boots clicked across the gravel path as she rushed toward the porch. She looked different, less polished. Her mascara had smudged just enough to make it look like she'd either been crying or wanted it to look that way. Rachel and I were sitting on the porch shelling peas into a large bowl between us. We didn't stop. Susan took the steps in twos and said, "You're ruining us." I kept my hand steady. She sniffed hard and went on, "Please, Linda, he's going to lose everything." Rachel leaned back in her chair and said, "Brace for impact." Susan blinked at her, confused. I looked up. "You poured my money into that business. You forged my name. You used Henry's death to cover your tracks. You left me on the side of the road." Susan shook her head, lips parting like she had a defense ready, but nothing came out. I stood slow and steady. I buried the man I loved for 43 years. I lost my home. I lost my son. But do you know what I found? She didn't answer. My name, my backbone, and an excellent lawyer. Rachel cleared her throat. "And don't forget your landlady." I didn't smile, but my jaw loosened just a little. Susan stepped back, her voice thinner now. "He's your son, Linda. Are you really going to let him lose everything?" I looked her in the eye. He already did, the moment he drove away. I turned and went inside without another word. We watched from the window as Susan sat in her car for a long time before finally pulling away. That night, Nora called. Eric had tried to file a countersuit claiming I was mentally unfit to make legal decisions at the time of the ownership transfer. Nora had shut it down before it reached a hearing. She had the affidavit from Penelope Briggs, the notarized documents, my medical records, the original deed. Her voice was calm, even slightly amused. "He underestimated you," she said. "That's usually their first mistake." By the end of the week, the title freeze went through. Eric couldn't refinance, borrow against, or sell a single square inch of the inn without my signature. And for the first time in months, I was no longer a ghost. I was a co-owner again in full legal standing. Word got around town. Grace from the general store sent over a pie. No note, just pie in a foiled tin wrapped in a clean dish towel. Small towns have long memories. People started asking questions. Why wasn't I at the B&B anymore? Why hadn't I been at the holiday open house? The answers didn't need to be spoken. Most folks already knew. Susan took down her lifestyle blog, the one that had boasted photos of the B&B with captions like "Our Family Legacy" and "Built from Love." Love apparently had taken a leave of absence. Rachel and I sat at the kitchen table that night, each with a slice of pie and a cup of decaf. "They thought I'd fold," I said. Rachel tapped her fork against her plate. "You're the only woman I know who can turn being discarded into a court case." I didn't hear from Eric again. Not directly. He kept his head down, maybe too ashamed or too angry. But Nora said mediation was next. I didn't flinch. I didn't stall. I told her to schedule it. I wanted to see him sit across the table from me and understand that this time I wouldn't be handing anything over. The mediation was held in a neutral office park just off the freeway. Gray siding, quiet lobby, a pot of coffee burning somewhere behind the front desk. I arrived with Nora. She wore charcoal slacks, a leather portfolio under one arm, and that expression I'd come to recognize, the one that meant no small talk, no nerves, just facts. Eric was already there. He sat on the other side of the conference table, a legal pad in front of him, untouched. He looked tired, older than I remembered. His tie was crooked. Susan wasn't with him. I didn't ask why. The mediator, a soft-spoken woman named Marlene, laid out the rules: respect no interruptions, confidentiality. I nodded. Eric glanced at the window, then back at the table. Nora spoke first. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She walked through the documents, the transfer of ownership, the forged signature, the use of my accounts without consent. She explained how I'd been removed from the property illegally. She presented receipts, bank statements, photos of my name scrubbed from every brochure and website listing. She ended with a printed screenshot of an email sent from Susan's account to a contractor describing me as an obstacle. Eric didn't argue. He didn't deny it. When Marlene asked if he had a response, he just said, "We thought it would be easier that way." I looked at him for a long time. For who? He didn't answer. Marlene asked if I had a proposal. Nora slid a folder across the table. Restoration of full ownership, public apology, financial restitution equal to the income diverted from my accounts over the last year, and finally a full exit from day-to-day operations by both Eric and Susan. They could remain minority stakeholders if they chose, but they would no longer have control. I would. Eric blinked once. That's not what Dad would have wanted. Nora raised her eyebrows slightly. Your father left her controlling interest for a reason. He looked at me. You want to push us out. You want to humiliate us. I folded my hands in my lap. I want my name back on the sign. He didn't speak for the rest of the session. When it ended, Marlene gave us both a moment outside in the hallway. I stepped toward the elevator. Eric followed. Mom, he said. I turned. I didn't think you'd fight me. I didn't say anything. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. You always wanted peace. I nodded. And now I want truth. He exhaled through his nose. We could have worked something out. You had your chance. The elevator arrived. I stepped inside. He didn't follow. Back at Rachel's, I set the signed agreement on the kitchen table. She read it, nodded once, then poured 2 glasses of sweet tea. He's going to resent you forever, she said. I know. She handed me a glass. Still worth it. I took a sip. The tea was cold, crisp, and just the right amount of bitter. The next week was quiet. Legal confirmation came through. My name was officially restored on the property deed, and a formal announcement went out to the inn's staff and mailing list. The newsletter read, Linda Weston returns as head of operations at the Jensen House Inn. No explanation, no apology, just fact. I went back for the first time on a Thursday. Rachel came with me, even though she didn't have to. The air smelled the same: lavender from the soap baskets, cinnamon from the cookies we used to bake in the afternoons for guests. The doormat was different, but the creak in the second stair still gave away your steps if you weren't careful. I walked room by room, touched the walls, counted towels, noted what needed paint and what had held up. The linens were fine, the coffee maker was not. I made a list. Downstairs, a young woman named Holly introduced herself as the new assistant manager. She'd never met me in person, but had seen my name on the original guest book dozens of times. She seemed nervous. I told her not to be. We talked for over an hour. She handed me a copy of the current bookings maintenance schedule and vendor contacts. I asked who handled the books now. She said Susan had hired an outside firm last year, but that she'd send over the contact info. I thanked her. Told her we'd be making some changes. She didn't object. Before I left, I stood at the front desk and looked out at the rose bushes. The yellow ones were blooming early this year. Back at Rachel's, we sat on the porch with a notepad between us. She flipped to a clean page. "You gonna rename it? I thought about it." "No," I said. "It's still the Jensen house." She nodded. "You'll make it yours again." "I already have." The sun dropped behind the trees. The wind picked up just enough to move the chimes. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. The kind of grounded that comes when the soil under your feet finally belongs to you again. The first guest to comment was a couple from Georgia who'd stayed in room 4. They left a handwritten note in the ledger. "So glad to see Linda Weston's name back on the welcome card. The inn feels like home again." Holly showed it to me the following morning, tucked neatly between check-in receipts and a restock list for the kitchen pantry. I didn't say anything at first, just smoothed my hand over the page and nodded. Small things came back gradually. My handwriting on the reservation board, fresh flowers on the breakfast tables, the ginger scones I used to bake before sunrise. Rachel came by 3 times that week with boxes from her attic, old framed photos, a few antique dishes she said belonged to Henry's grandmother, and the faded wooden sign we'd hung the day the inn opened. It read, "The Jensen House, since 1978. We mounted it back over the fireplace. By the end of that first month, bookings had doubled. Guests began asking if I still hosted garden walks. I brought them back just one afternoon a week, walking the back Rose Trail with groups of 4 or 5. I wore my sun hat, carried a basket of clippers and gloves, and talked about how to prune for second bloom. It felt quiet, familiar, like I'd slipped back into something that still fit. Then one evening, I got a voicemail. It was from Susan. Her voice was clipped. "I understand you've removed our access to the vendor accounts. That wasn't part of the agreement." I sat at the desk and listened to it twice. Nora confirmed that yes, I had full authority to sever or reassign vendor contracts provided written notice, which I had done, calmly, legally, professionally. 2 days later, Eric showed up. He didn't make a scene, just stood out front in a navy windbreaker holding an envelope. I stepped outside. We didn't go far, just a few steps off the porch. "This is a letter of intent," he said. "Susan and I are filing to sell our shares." I nodded. Understood. He didn't look angry. Just finished. "You're going to run it by yourself?" he asked. "I've got help." He glanced toward the windows. That girl, Holly, and Rachel. He paused, then handed me the envelope. "Dad always said you'd outlast all of us." I tucked the letter into my cardigan pocket. He was usually right. He didn't stay long. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the garden alone. The hydrangeas were full. Blue this year, not pink. Must have been the change in soil. I sat on the bench Henry built back in '84 and watched a redbird flicker through the hedge line. When I got back to the house, Rachel was already in the kitchen pouring 2 glasses of iced tea. "You going to tell the staff?" she asked. I set the envelope on the table. "Monday morning, we'll make it official." That night, I drafted the notice. Simple language, no drama. Just a line about the change in ownership and a note of thanks to Eric and Susan for their past contributions. I added my name at the bottom. Owner and operator. Linda Weston. When Monday came, I read it aloud at the staff meeting. Holly stood beside me. Nobody raised a hand. Nobody complained. Most just nodded and got back to work. That afternoon, I walked into town for the first time in weeks. The post office clerk waved and asked if I was back for good. I said yes. She handed me a bundle of mail and smiled. Things feel right again. The last stop was the hardware store. I picked up a new brass plate for the front sign. Nothing fancy, just our name, the inn's founding year, and one final line etched at the bottom, "Welcome home." The brass plate caught the morning sun just right. I stood at the bottom of the porch steps with my hands tucked into my cardigan pockets, watching as Rachel wiped a fingerprint off the corner and stepped back. She gave me a look, not needing to say anything. We both knew what it meant to see my name back where it belonged. The week after Eric and Susan sold their shares was quieter than I expected. No drama, no fanfare. Just a slow return to routine. The guests came and went, the kitchen buzzed with breakfast chatter, and the garden bloomed like it had been waiting for me all along. I found my rhythm again, not the exact same one I had with Henry, but something steady, something mine. Mornings started early with scones and strong coffee, followed by handwritten notes tucked beside each room's tray. Afternoons, I spent out back pruning the hydrangeas or walking the halls with Holly, talking through repairs and ideas. She was young, thoughtful, patient. She asked questions, took notes, and never once treated me like I was too old to have a vision. Sometimes I'd catch her smiling when guests called me Mrs. Weston or mentioned the old recipes were back. Rachel came by most Sundays. We sat on the porch with peach tea and watched the breeze move through the trees. She told me stories I'd forgotten about Henry, about the early days of the inn, about how I used to sing while folding linens. One afternoon, she brought me a photo album, one of the old leather-bound ones with yellowing corners. Inside were pictures I hadn't seen in decades: our first Christmas at the inn, the ribbon cutting with the mayor, Eric's 6th birthday, with a giant chocolate cake in room 2. I turned each page, slowly stopping at one, with Henry standing beside me in the kitchen, both of us laughing, my apron smudged with flour. It reminded me that the inn was never just a business. It was a place built with love, and even if the people in it changed, the foundation held. One evening in late August, I stood at the window and looked out over the lawn. The porch lights were on, casting a soft glow over the walkway. A couple from Vermont had just checked in for their anniversary. I'd left a bottle of cider and 2 glasses in their room, along with a handwritten card. Downstairs, Holly was locking up. I could hear the quiet click of the bolt and the rustle of the guestbook pages as she tucked it under the counter. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. Eric never came back. Susan mailed a box of things: old receipts, a backup key, a stack of outdated menus. No note. I didn't need one. Some endings don't come with apologies or explanations. Just space. And sometimes that's enough. I still think about Henry, especially when the light shifts through the lace curtains just right, or when a guest says the inn has a calmness they can't quite name. I like to think it's him. Or maybe it's just what we built together, piece by piece, year by year. I don't know what comes next. Maybe I'll let Holly take over more of the day-to-day. Maybe I'll teach her how to make Henry's spice cake from scratch. Maybe I'll just keep showing up each morning and doing what I can with what I have. But I do know this kindness matters. Quiet strength matters. And no matter how far things drift, it's never too late to reclaim your place. Thank you for listening to my story. If it reminded you of someone you love or a place you've lost and found again, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you've ever stood up for your own worth, no matter how late, don't forget to hit that like button. You've earned it.